Hey everybody, it's hwsteele, and today's April 6, 2021, which makes this the first weekly video for the month of April 2021. Now in this video I want to talk to you a little bit about cycles, two different types of cycles. I'll call them type 1 and type 2, just to keep things a little bit more clear in the explanation of it. A type 1 cycle is really just a natural cycle. It's a cycle that we can observe astronomically, like the day, the year. Those are two cycles that are based on the sun and the earth. And then there's also like the monthly cycle, which is based on the sun, the earth, and the moon. And then we can involve any number of different planets to create any number of different cycles. But specifically, each cycle requires there to be two things involved, at least a planet and the sun, or a planet and another planet. So we have cycles, for instance, like orbital periods of planets that requires the specific planet and the sun. Then we have sonatic cycles, which are just typically orbital periods of at least two planets and the sun, or the orbital periods of the planets around the sun, I should say. So the reality is a natural cycle always requires at least two things: the sun and a planet, or for instance the moon. The orbital period of the moon requires their earth and the moon to be calculated together. And then if we add the sun into that mix, it creates the Sonatic month, which is slightly longer than the orbital period of the moon. So there's always at least two things in a naturally occurring cycle that we can observe. I think that's one thing that people tend to forget when they think of, for instance, like the orbital period of the Earth is 1 year. They think of it as that's an Earth cycle, but the reality is it's an Earth-Sun cycle. If we think of the orbital period of Venus, which is 225 Earth days, then that isn't just a Venus cycle, that's a Venus-Sun cycle. So that's something to keep in mind. So Sonatic cycles involve not just the two planets that you might be, for instance, Mercury and Venus together. Their orbital periods create a Sonatic cycle of 144 days. So that is a cycle that's between Mercury, Venus, and the sun, actually. So keep that in mind with your type 1 cycles that we're talking about. The type 2 cycles that I'm going to talk about are cycles that are naturally occurring cycles, and then mathematics is applied to them. So here's an example of that. If I were to say the 7-day cycle or the 7-year cycle, that's a natural cycle, the day and the year, but it's multiplied by the number 7, right? Pretty simple, not a very hard concept. I'm sure all of you understand that one already. So we have these type 1 and type 2 cycles. So when looking at the type 2 cycles, we're going to find that a lot of things that are observed in the stock market come very close to type 2 cycles. For instance, the 7-day cycle, which of course is the week, and the 7-year cycle, which is a week of years. Those cycles are very important cycles, but they also have cycles that are very close to them. Now, here's what I mean. Let me give you an example for both of those types of cycles here. The 7-day cycle, we have the orbital period, the rotational period of the Earth, 1 day. We multiply it by 7, so this becomes a type 2 cycle. Well, there's also the orbital period of the moon, which is 27.32 days. And if we divide that by 4, we get very close to 7 days. It's not exactly 7 days, but it's very close to it. So in this case, we have a type 2 cycle of 6.83 days. And this cycle is just as valid, or can be just as valid, as the first cycle. Okay? So it was both of these type 2 cycles, the 7-day cycle and the 6.83-day cycle, are derived from a naturally occurring cycle, and then mathematics are applied to it. So because these two type 2 cycles are very close to each other, they can mess things up with your forecasting. If you go, okay, I'm only focusing on the 7-day cycle, the fact that this guy's out there might confound the situation a bit. You might see, well, something's happening because things are happening right before 7 days. And if you don't realize that this is going on right here, the 6.83 day cycle, then you don't understand what's happening. You're getting interference from this cycle, or maybe more specifically, what you're looking at in the market is actually obeying this type 2 cycle better. Okay, so another example would be the 7-year cycle. So we have the orbital period of the Earth around the Sun. That's 1 year. We multiply that by 7. It creates the 7-year cycle. We say, okay, the 7-year cycle, that's going to do this or that to the stock market or whichever market. But then we have the orbital period of Saturn, which is 29.46 years, and we divide that by 4, and we get 7.365 year cycle, which is 88.38, so almost 88 and a half months. And of course, 7 years times 12 is 84 months. So you've got these two cycles, these two type 2 cycles that we're talking about, and they're a little bit different from each other. One's 84 months, one's 88 and a half months approximately. And so if you're just focused on this cycle, and then what you're looking at stretches out a little bit, and it actually comes very close to 88 or 89 months, and you're not aware of the fact that this cycle, this type 2 cycle is out there, then you can, again, be confused, just like in the other example that I gave. So long story short here, and Gann actually gave a lot of examples like this, is you don't want to just come to what we're calling a type 2 cycle from one direction. You want to see if you can come at it from multiple directions, because you're going to find that the numbers aren't always the same. In other words, if you multiply the day by 7, you get the week, but dividing the lunar cycle by 4 doesn't give you exactly 7 days. So there's a variance there, and both of those cycles, because they're type 2 cycles, the 7-day cycle and the 6.83 day cycle, are just as valid as each other. One's derived from the Earth, one's derived from the Moon and the Earth. Or I should say the first one was the Earth and the Sun, and the second one is the Moon and the Earth. So they're both important cycles, natural type 1 cycles, but when we put the mathematics to that cycle and create the type 2 cycle, there's many times these secondary type 2 cycles that are very close to the first that can interfere with the first one. So hopefully this wasn't too confusing to you. The very basic outline is there's two types of cycles. One of them is a natural cycle, and that's a type 1 cycle. The other one is a natural cycle that's either multiplied or divided, creating these type 2 cycles, which are really cycles with mathematics applied to them. And when you create a type 2 cycle, many times there's secondary cycles that are really close to it that will mess with the results that you're getting. So you need to be aware of them so that you can understand, because you might be able to fine-tune your forecasting and realize, hey, this market keeps going just a little over 7 years, and it turns out it's actually 1/4 of Saturn and not 7 times the solar cycle. So anyway, hopefully this wasn't too confusing, and hopefully it helps some people, and I will talk to all of you next week.